He chose his mistress in front of everyone, and 5 minutes later, the entire ballroom was drowning in blood. Tonight was supposed to be about power, about image, about the kind of dominance that makes other men lower their eyes when Dorian Vescari walks into a room. Instead, it became the night he publicly destroyed his wife in front of every crime family, every politician, every camera lens in Chicago, and handed his enemies exactly what they had been waiting years to use against him. If you've ever watched a man burn down everything good in his life because he was too proud to listen, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let me see how far this story travels. Now stay close because nothing about this night ends the way anyone expected. The Meridian Grand Hotel had been dressed to lie. That was the only honest way to describe it. The chandeliers hanging like frozen explosions above the ballroom floor. The white linen so crisp it looked surgical. The ice sculptures already beginning to sweat at the edges, while men in tailored suits pretended they were something other than what they were. Philanthropists, civic leaders, champions of the disadvantaged. The Romano Syndicate's annual charity gala was the most expensive fiction Chicago produced each year, and everyone inside its walls had paid a significant amount of money to participate in that fiction without blinking. Selina Vescari had attended 7 of them. She stood near the East Corridor now, a glass of sparkling water in her hand. Never alcohol, not at events like this, because alcohol softened the edges, and she had learned a long time ago that soft edges got people killed, and she watched the room the way she had taught herself to watch every room her husband occupied. Not at him, around him. The geometry of who stood close and who kept deliberate distance, the angles of exits, the weight of every smile directed at the man she had married 11 years ago in a church that no longer stood. Dorian was holding court near the main stage, his dark suit cut precisely enough to cost more than most men in this city earned in 3 months. 44 years old and still built like someone who had never stopped expecting violence. Black hair going silver at the temples, jaw set in that particular arrangement that meant he was performing patience while actually feeling none. He laughed at something one of the Carlucci representatives said, a laugh that reached exactly as far as his teeth and no further. Celine watched his hand. He kept his right hand free, always. Even here, even dressed like a board member of something legitimate, Dorian Vescari kept his right hand unencumbered because the habit was older than his marriage and probably older than his conscience. She noticed Vivian Cross 20 minutes before anything happened. That was the thing no one would understand later, when the stories got told and retold and simplified into the version that fit neatly inside a headline. People would assume Celine had been blindsided, that she had stood there in her wine-colored gown, elegant and oblivious, while the woman her husband had been sleeping with for 8 months glided into the room and dismantled her life. That was the story that made sense to people who had never paid attention to anything harder than their own comfort. The truth was uglier and more precise. Celine had known about Vivian Cross for 6 of those 8 months. She had a name, a history, a prior association with the Drago organization that stretched back 4 years before Vivian ever crossed paths with Dorian. She had 3 photographs taken by a man she paid in cash out of her personal account, not the household account, not anything Dorian could trace. And she had a handwritten list of questions she had not yet been able to answer. Questions about timing, about access, about which pieces of information had moved from inside the Vescari organization to outside it in the months since Vivian appeared. She had been trying to tell Dorian for 11 days. He hadn't let her finish a sentence. Vivian entered from the south corridor at precisely 9:47. Celine clocked her the way you clock something you've been dreading, with a cold, specific clarity that bypasses feeling entirely and goes straight to function. The woman was extraordinary to look at, and Celine had enough self-possession to acknowledge that without flinching. Tall, red dress that understood exactly what it was doing. Dark hair pinned in a way that looked effortless and had probably taken an hour. She moved through the room with the particular confidence of someone who had already decided how this night was going to go. Celine set her water glass down on a passing tray and started toward Dorian. She didn't run. Running in a room full of these men was the same as bleeding in a room full of sharks. It triggered something primal and predatory that had nothing to do with the immediate threat. She moved with intention, cutting through small clusters of conversation, nodding once at Marcus Albano from the city planning office, who tried to intercept her, not stopping. She reached Dorian's circle just as Vivian slid into it from the other side. Dorian. Celine kept her voice level. 3 feet of air and about 11 years of accumulated damage between them. I need 2 minutes. He glanced at her. That glance. She had catalogued it over the years, the precise taxonomy of his inattention. This one was the dismissive variety, the kind that said he had already decided what she was going to say and had already decided it didn't matter. We're in the middle of something, Celine. I know what we're in the middle of. Her eyes moved to Vivian, deliberate enough that there was no pretending it was accidental. That's why I need 2 minutes. Something shifted in the air around them. The Carlucci representative took a small step back. Another man found somewhere else to look. These were men who understood the particular pressure of a domestic situation, detonating inside a professional setting, and their instinct was the same as it always was. Create distance, observe, make no move that could be interpreted as choosing a side. Vivian smiled. It was the kind of smile that knew it was being watched. Don't let me interrupt, Vivian said. Her voice was warm and textured and entirely controlled. I can find a drink. You're not interrupting anything. Dorian said it without looking at Celine. The dismissal was so complete it was almost architectural. He had simply removed her from the structure of the conversation. Celine, we'll talk later. There won't be a later if you don't listen to me right now. His jaw tightened. A small motion, visible only to someone who had spent a decade studying the geography of his face. Is that a threat? It's a fact. She's been in contact with Lucian Drago. I have enough. The word came out quiet and hard, the way he said things when he was close to the edge of his patience and wanted you to understand that without having to demonstrate it. His eyes finally found hers, and what was in them wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder. Certainty. The absolute conviction of a man who has already constructed the story he believes and has no interest in evidence that contradicts it. You're embarrassing yourself. Dorian, I said enough. He turned away from her. That was the moment. Not the next thing that happened, not the public performance on the stage, but that simple rotation of his body away from hers, the decision to look at Vivian Cross instead of his wife. That was where it actually broke. Everything after was just the sound it made on the way down. The stage announcement came at 10 o'clock as scheduled. The Romano Syndicate's contribution to the Children's Literacy Initiative, a 6-figure donation that would be photographed and distributed and serve its actual purpose of laundering goodwill across every political connection the family maintained. Standard procedure. Every year, Dorian escorted Celine to the stage, Betrayal. Every year, they stood together under the lights and performed the specific version of themselves that this room required. This year, Dorian crossed the ballroom with Vivian Cross on his arm. The silence that preceded the reaction was perhaps 3 seconds long. 3 seconds of the room recalibrating, of people processing what they were seeing against what they expected to see, of the social math resolving into something no one had prepared a response for. Then the murmur started, low and spreading, the sound of 200 people simultaneously deciding they needed to say something to the person standing next to them. Celine did not move. She stood where he had left her and watched him walk that woman onto the stage, watched the photographers. Because of course there were photographers, there were always photographers at these things. That was the entire point. Pivot and adjust and start capturing something that was going to look very different in print tomorrow morning than it looked in this room tonight. She felt the eyes come to her the way she always felt things she refused to look at directly, as pressure, as heat, as the collective weight of people waiting to see what she would do. She didn't give them anything. A hand touched her arm. Genevieve Albano, Marcus's wife, a woman who had always been kind to Celine in the particular way of someone who suspected things were bad and didn't know how to say so. Celine, come sit with us. I'm fine. You don't have to. Genevieve. She said the name gently because it wasn't Genevieve's fault and the woman didn't deserve what was in Celine's voice right now. I'm fine. Go back to your husband. On the stage, Dorian was saying something into the microphone. His voice carried across the ballroom, smooth and measured, the public voice he had spent years constructing. Vivienne stood slightly behind him, her posture perfect, her expression composed into something that managed to be simultaneously modest and triumphant. The photographers kept shooting. Celine's phone vibrated against her palm. She had been holding it for the last hour, the habit of it, the specific vigilance. She looked at the screen. The message was from a number she recognized, one of 3 burner contacts she maintained for situations that required discretion. 4 words. They're already inside. Move. The first sound came 9 seconds later. It wasn't what people imagined afterward when they described it. The dramatic crash, the cinematic percussion of movie violence. It was smaller and more specific than that. A single sharp crack from somewhere above the main floor, the kind of sound that the brain initially misfiles as something ordinary and then immediately retrieves and reclassifies. One person near the bar went down. The glassware behind him turned into a brief, bright catastrophe of light and sound. Then the room understood what it was hearing, and everything happened simultaneously. The screaming started in overlapping waves, different sections of the ballroom reaching comprehension at slightly different moments, the sound building on itself until it became something physical, something you felt in your sternum. Tables went over, chairs scattered. 200 people who had spent the evening performing wealth and influence reverted in seconds to pure mammalian terror. The suits and gowns irrelevant, the titles and connections irrelevant. Nothing mattering except the direction of the exits and whether the person in front of you was moving fast enough. Celine was already moving. Not toward an exit. The exits were where everyone else was going, which meant the exits were where the bottlenecks were, which meant the exits were exactly where you did not want to be in the first 90 seconds of this kind of chaos. She had studied the hotel's floor plan 3 months ago, not because she had predicted tonight specifically, but because she had learned, in the years of being Dorian Viscari's wife, that knowing where you were was the only advantage you could guarantee yourself. She went left, toward the kitchen corridor, keeping low, moving along the wall where the sightlines from the upper gallery were worst. She could hear shouting now underneath the screaming, male voices, organized, the specific cadence of men executing a plan rather than reacting to chaos, which meant this wasn't opportunistic, which meant the information she had been trying to give Dorian for 11 days had been accurate, and she hadn't been wrong, and the only thing it cost her to be right was everything. She hit the kitchen doors and pushed through. The kitchen was still partially staffed, 2 line cooks and a dishwasher who hadn't made it out yet, all 3 of them pressed against the far wall with the particular stillness of people trying very hard to become furniture. Celine scanned the space in 3 seconds. She found what she was looking for on the second pass. The service elevator at the back, and adjacent to it, the door she had marked on the floor plan. Utility access. Stairwell down. "There's a door at the end of this hall," she said to the 3 kitchen staff, keeping her voice flat and specific. "Takes you to the parking substructure. Go now. Don't use the main garage exits. Find the pedestrian door on the east side of level B2. Do you understand me?" The younger of the line cooks stared at her. He couldn't have been more than 22. "Do you understand me?" He nodded. "Go." They went. She waited 3 seconds to make sure they were moving, then she found the utility door and pulled it open and went down. The service tunnels under the Meridian Grand were exactly what she had expected. Concrete and pipe and the particular smell of systems that kept a luxury building functioning without ever being seen. Fluorescent tubes every 15 feet, casting light that was accurate but cheerless. She moved quickly, counting intersections against the map she had built in her head, listening for footsteps that weren't hers. She heard them at the second junction. She stopped, put her back against the wall, waited. 2 men came around the corner at a pace that wasn't frantic but was urgent, moving with the efficiency of people who knew where they were going. She recognized the first one by the way he moved before she could see his face clearly. Petra, one of Dorian's mid-level security captains, a man she had seen at enough events to know his walk. The second man was younger, one of the field operatives, his jacket torn at the shoulder and his face carrying a fresh cut across the cheekbone. Petra saw her and stopped so abruptly the younger man almost walked into him. "Mrs. Vescari." His voice had the quality of a man revising his understanding of a situation in real time. "Petra." She pushed off the wall. "How many of you are down here?" Just us, ma'am. We lost contact with the others when the signal went out. He paused. The signal went out on all of them. All the earpieces, all the phones on the secured channel, simultaneously. She let that land where it needed to land. How many gunmen did you count? At least 12 that I saw positioned before it started. Possibly more in the upper gallery. Federal vehicles outside? He looked at her differently then. The recalibration was visible on his face. The moment when whatever category he had kept her in stopped being sufficient. Yes, ma'am. At least 4 SUVs on the north perimeter when I came down. More on the way, probably. Celine exhaled slowly through her nose. 12 gunmen inside, federal containment outside, every secured communication channel dead. And somewhere in the chaos above them, Dorian Vescari was either already captured or trying to fight his way out of an ambush with half the information he needed. She thought about the stage, about the moment Vivienne Cross had been standing right there, visible, present, and then the first shot had fired. How fast had Vivienne moved? How much space had appeared around her before anyone else in the room understood what was happening? We need to get back up there, she said. Petra stared at her. Mrs. Vescari, the building is compromised. The protocol in this situation is to... I know what the protocol is. She had written half of it, or rather she had spent enough years listening to the men in this organization explain things to each other that she understood the protocols better than most of the people meant to execute them. The protocol was designed for an attack from outside. This attack was designed from inside, which means the protocol has holes in it, and the people executing it don't know where the holes are. She looked at him steadily. I do. The younger operative was watching her with an expression she recognized. Not disrespect exactly, but the particular uncertainty of a man who had been trained to take orders from a specific set of people and was now being confronted with someone who was not on that list but clearly should have been. She didn't wait for either of them to finish deciding. She turned and went back the way she had come, moving fast now, taking the junction that led toward the hotel's central mechanical room. Behind her, after a beat that lasted exactly as long as it took 2 men to look at each other and reach an unspoken agreement, she heard footsteps following. The mechanical room gave her access to the building's internal camera system, not the live feed, the backup system, analog relays that wouldn't have been touched by whatever signal disruption had taken out the communications network. She found the panel she was looking for in under a minute, jury-rigged the connection the way a man she had once watched very carefully for 2 years had shown her without knowing he was showing her, and pulled up what she could. The ballroom feed was chaos. She couldn't get a clean count of anything. But the lobby feed, the service corridor feed, the feed from the underground garage, those told her things. The positions of the gunmen on the lobby feed told her they weren't trying to maximize casualties. They were herding, driving people toward specific exits while covering others, controlling the flow of who got out and who didn't. She looked at the garage feed for a long time, at the vehicles, at the specific way they were positioned, at the one figure moving between them who wore the body language of someone coordinating rather than containing. She recognized the build before she could see the face, the particular width of the shoulders, the way the head moved when the person was processing information quickly, that slight tilt, almost imperceptible, that she had seen at 24 family dinners and 3 Vescari funerals, and once, memorably, at a meeting she had not been supposed to be in the room for. Cassian Vescari, Dorian's younger cousin. The man who had spent the last 3 years positioning himself as the most loyal member of the family, while Celine had quietly watched the contradictions accumulate like a debt. She stood very still in the mechanical room with the 2 men behind her and looked at the screen and felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief, and was mostly the cold, clarifying sensation of a thing you already suspected being confirmed. She had been right about all of it. The affair, the leak, the timing. The impossible specificity with which this attack had neutralized every security measure Dorian had put in place. Measures that Cassian had helped design. But she had been looking at Vivienne so hard, she hadn't looked far enough back. She had identified the instrument without seeing the hand that was holding it. Above her, somewhere in the building that was now a crime scene and a battlefield simultaneously, her husband was fighting for his life with an incomplete picture of who was trying to take it, and the man who had handed their enemies the blueprint to destroy everything, who had engineered the affair, poisoned the trust, positioned the pieces, and then stood back to watch the explosion from a safe distance. Was standing in the parking garage below, coordinating the cleanup. Celine looked at Petra. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and when I do, you're going to want to make a decision very quickly about who you're actually loyal to." Petra's face was a controlled surface over a roiling uncertainty. "Tell me." She pointed at the screen, at the figure moving between the vehicles, at the man Dorian trusted the way you trust family, which was to say completely, which was to say fatally, which was to say in exactly the way people trusted the things most capable of destroying them. Both men looked at the screen. The younger operative made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Petra said nothing for a long moment. Then, "How long have you known?" "Long enough," Celine said. "Not long enough to stop this. Long enough to stop what comes next." She turned away from the screen. "But I need to find Dorian before Cassian does. And I need to do it before whoever's running the federal unit outside figures out this is more complicated than a standard raid." She looked at both of them, the line of her jaw set and unapologetic. "Are you with me or not?" The younger man answered first. It wasn't the answer she expected. He reached into his jacket and put a compact handgun on the work table between them, gripped toward her, the gesture unambiguous. "You're going to need this more than I do," he said. She looked at the gun. She looked at him. She picked it up. The gun was cold and compact in Celine's hand, and she held it the way she held most things that frightened her, without letting the fear reach her grip. Petra was already moving toward the door, his training overriding whatever personal reckoning he was still working through. The younger operative, she learned his name was Dex, 26 years old, 18 months with the Viscari security detail, had given her his weapon with the kind of finality that meant he had already decided something he hadn't put into words yet. She didn't ask him to explain it. There wasn't time, and she had learned a long time ago that asking men to articulate their loyalties out loud usually just gave them an opportunity to reconsider them. "Dorian would have gone for the secondary stairwell off the main corridor," Petra said, his voice low and clipped. "That's the extraction protocol, if he followed it." "If," Celine said. "He doesn't always follow it." "No," she agreed. "He doesn't." She pulled up the last camera feed she had access to, the north stairwell, and scanned it for 15 seconds. Nothing, which meant either it was clear or the angle was wrong. She made the call the way she had been making calls for the last 20 minutes, which was with the information she had and the willingness to be wrong about it. "North stairwell," she said. "We move fast and we don't stop for anything that isn't Dorian or one of ours. Anything else, we go around." Dex nodded. Petra was already at the door. They went back into the tunnel. The sounds from above had changed in character. The initial chaos of the attack, the screaming, the directionless percussion of mass panic, had settled into something more organized and therefore more dangerous. She could hear movement above the ceiling, the specific cadence of people who knew where they were going. The gunmen were consolidating, which meant the first phase of whatever this was had concluded, and the second phase was beginning, and the window between those two things was the only window she had. The stairwell access came up on the left. Petra took the corner first, cleared it with the professionalism of a man who had done exactly this in less controlled circumstances, and waved them through. The stairwell smelled like concrete dust and something chemical, smoke from somewhere above, drifting down through the gaps in the fireproofing. Celine went up fast, staying right, watching the angles above her as each landing came into view. Second floor? Third. The sounds were louder here. They found the first body on the fourth floor landing. One of Dorian's security men, older, barrel-chested, a face Celine recognized from the perimeter rotation. He was on his back with his jacket still buttoned, which meant he'd never had time to reach his weapon. She looked at him for exactly 1 second, long enough to confirm what she already knew, and then she kept moving. Petra made a sound in his throat that was not quite grief and not quite anger. "Keep going," she said. The fifth floor corridor was where they found Renner. Renner was one of Dorian's inner circle, mid-40s, former military before the family recruited him, a man with the particular competence of someone who had survived enough bad situations to stop being surprised by them. He was on his feet, which was the first good sign, pressed into a doorway alcove with a weapon drawn and his left arm held at an angle that said something was wrong with it. When he saw Celine come around the corner ahead of Petra, his expression went through 3 distinct phases in about 2 seconds: recognition, disbelief, recalibration. Mrs. Viscari. His voice was rough and compressed. What the... Where is he? 6th floor, east wing, last I saw. He's got 2 men with him. Renner pushed off the wall, wincing. His phone is dead. All of ours are dead. I know. She was already moving past him. Can you walk? I'm walking, aren't I? Good. Follow Petra. Do what I say when I say it. She glanced back at him once. How many of theirs are between here and the 6th floor? Renner's jaw worked. At least 3 on the stairwell. Maybe more in the corridor. They've got the east elevators covered. What about the service access on the west side? A pause. He looked at her the way people looked at her when they were realizing that they had been underestimating the amount of attention she paid to things. Should be clear. It's a linen closet access, connects to the service corridor on 6. Then that's where we're going. She didn't wait to see if he followed. He did. The service corridor on the 6th floor smelled like cleaning products and recycled air, and underneath both of those, the copper and cordite smell of recent violence. Celine pushed through the linen access door and held position, listening. 40 feet down the corridor, a door was slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see the edge of light that suggested occupancy. She crossed the distance in silence, put her back against the wall beside the door, and pushed it open with 2 fingers. Dorian Viscari was on one knee behind an overturned room service cart, his jacket gone, a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled down the side of his face and dried into something that looked worse than it probably was. One of his men was to his left, covering the room's main entrance. The other was down, not dead, Celine could see him breathing, but clearly out of the fight. Dorian looked up when the door moved. For the first quarter second, his eyes were pure reflex. The weapon came up, the assessment locked in. The trigger finger made a decision. Then he saw her face, and something complicated happened to his expression that she didn't have time to interpret. Celine, her name in his mouth like a thing he hadn't expected to be saying. We need to move, she said. Service corridor is clear. We have Petra, Dex, and Renner. He stared at her. Behind her, she heard Petra come through the door, and Dorian's gaze moved to him with an expression that was fractionally less complicated. She found me, Petra said, with a flatness that communicated more than the words did. She had the tunnel access. Camera feed. She knew where you'd be before I did. Something moved through Dorian's face at that. She didn't examine it. Can he walk? She nodded toward the man on the floor. If I help him, Dorian said. Then help him. We have maybe 4 minutes before they finish consolidating the stairwells and start doing a floor-by-floor sweep. She moved to the window, looked down at the street. Federal vehicles exactly where Petra had described. 2 additional units she hadn't anticipated on the south side. The perimeter was tighter than she'd hoped. We're not going out the front. We're not going out any of the primary exits. Then where? Dorian was on his feet now, getting his arm under the injured man's shoulder. There's a freight loading dock on the basement level, accessible from the west service corridor. It connects to an alley that runs behind the hotel to the parking structure on Meridian Avenue. It won't be covered. How do you know it won't be covered? She looked at him directly for the first time since the ballroom. Because whoever planned this covered everything they knew about. And they didn't know about everything. She let that sit exactly as long as it needed to. That's the conversation we're going to have once we're out of this building. Right now, I need you to move. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. She counted them. Then he looked away first, and they moved. The descent was controlled and ugly in the way that real things were ugly. No clean lines, no economy of motion, just 5 people moving through a hostile space with incomplete information and the constant low-grade arithmetic of what they could afford to lose. Renner was slower than he'd claimed, the arm worse than he'd let on. Dex covered the rear with a focus that suggested he was running on something past adrenaline, something more metabolic and less sustainable. Petra was the steadiest of all of them, the kind of steady that came from having done this before and knowing that steadiness was a choice you made repeatedly rather than a quality you possessed. They made it to the 4th floor before the first problem. Two of the gunmen coming up the West Service stairwell. Celine heard them before she saw them, the specific sound of two people trying to be quiet in a concrete stairwell, which was fundamentally different from one person trying to be quiet. She stopped the group with a closed fist gesture she had seen the security team use often enough that it was muscle memory now, and she moved to the stairwell door and listened. Petra was beside her in 2 steps. He looked at her. She held up 2 fingers. He nodded. What happened next took about 8 seconds, and she did not look away from any of it, because looking away was a luxury, and she had forfeited luxuries tonight. When it was over, Petra was breathing harder than he had been, and one of his knuckles was split, and they went through the stairwell door and kept moving. Dorian was watching her when she came back to the group. She could feel it without looking at him. The specific quality of his attention when he was revising something he thought he understood. She didn't give him anything to work with, not yet. The basement, the freight corridor, the loading dock door that opened onto the alley exactly as she had described, the cold night air hitting them like a flat hand, the sound of the city continuing to exist beyond the perimeter of this disaster. Celine went first, scanned the alley in both directions, confirmed it was clear, and waved them through. They made it to the parking structure on Meridian Avenue in 4 minutes. She had a vehicle on the 3rd level, not one of Dorian's fleet vehicles, not anything registered to the family or to her name. A gray sedan she had arranged 6 weeks ago through a contact who owed her a significant favor and knew better than to ask what it was for. She had the key in the inner pocket of her gown, and the fact that she was standing in a parking structure in heels with a borrowed gun and the remnants of an evening that had detonated in every direction made the key feel like the most ordinary thing in the world. She drove. Nobody argued about that. Renner got the injured man, whose name was apparently Torres, and who had a broken rib and a crease across his left shoulder blade from a round that had been closer than anyone was comfortable saying out loud, into the back seat. Dex got in beside them. Petra took the front passenger seat. Dorian stood outside the driver's door for one specific moment that she felt without looking at it. The moment where a man who had spent his entire adult life being the person in control of every room he occupied stood outside a car his wife was about to drive and made a decision about what that meant. He got in the back. She pulled out of the structure without lights until she reached the street. They drove for 20 minutes without speaking. She took a route that doubled back twice, watching the mirrors with the systematic attention of someone who had been paying attention to things nobody expected her to pay attention to. The city slid past the windows, indifferent and continuous. At some point, Torres made a sound in the back seat that might have been pain or might have been something he was trying not to let be pain. She pulled into a storage facility on the west side, rented under a name that wasn't hers, paid in cash, containing supplies she had assembled over 18 months with the specific patience of someone who hoped they'd never need them, but knew better than to operate on hope. She parked inside and killed the engine and sat in the silence for a moment, her hands on the wheel, feeling the vibration of the last 3 hours try to catch up with her. She didn't let it. She got out. Found the medical kit. Started on Torres first because Torres was the most urgent problem. It was while she was working on Torres that Dorian came to stand beside her. She could feel him there, the particular displaced air of a large man who was trying to take up less space than usual. She didn't stop what she was doing. "You knew," he said. "Yes." "How long?" "Long enough." Celine. Her name again. Different this time. Stripped of the dismissal, stripped of the performance, just the 2 syllables and whatever was underneath them. "How long have you known about Vivian?" She tied off the bandage around Torres's shoulder, checked his pupils, told him to stay still and stay awake. Then she stood up and turned to face her husband for the first time with actual stillness, neither of them in motion, neither of them performing anything for anyone else's benefit. His face was worse up close. The cut above his eyebrow had been deeper than she'd assessed from across the room, and there was bruising developing along his jaw that she hadn't seen in the dim light of the service corridor. He looked older than he had this morning. He looked like a man who had just had his understanding of the last year of his life taken apart and handed back to him in pieces. 6 months, she said. He absorbed that. She watched it hit him, not dramatically, not with the visible collapse of movie grief, but with the specific interior concussion of a fact that reorganized everything around it. 6 months. The duration of his conviction that she was jealous and irrational and wrong. The duration of every conversation he had shut down, every sentence he hadn't let her finish, every time he had turned away from her in exactly the way he had turned away from her tonight on that ballroom floor. You should have told me. The sound she made was not quite a laugh. It had the shape of one without the warmth. I tried to tell you 11 times, Dorian. I have the dates written down. You should have tried harder. You should have listened once. She said it without heat, which was worse than if she'd said it with heat. Heat suggested there was still something live there, some current still running between them. What she said it with was the temperature of something that had already concluded. I tried harder. I found different ways to say it. I brought you information, and you called me jealous. I brought you specific details, and you told me I was trying to undermine the relationship because I couldn't accept that you'd moved on. She held his gaze. So I stopped trying to tell you, and I started preparing for what was going to happen when you found out I was right. Dorian looked at her for a long moment. That's what all this is. He meant the car, the storage unit, the medical supplies, the borrowed gun, and the tunnel access, and the camera system she had jury-rigged in the basement of a hotel she had studied the floor plan of 3 months in advance. That's what all this is, she confirmed. Something moved through him that was not quite shame and was closer to the specific devastation of a man confronting the cost of his own certainty. She had seen that expression on other men in other situations and had always found it inadequate. The realization coming too late. The recognition arriving after the damage was already done. The remorse that was really just the grief of consequence. On Dorian's face, it looked like something else. It looked like a man who had known, on some level he refused to visit, that this was coming. Vivian, he started. Is gone, Celine said. She was gone before the first shot. Whatever she told you, whatever she made you feel. She was a tool, Dorian. Someone put her in front of you and you picked her up. She watched him. We need to talk about who. She moved to the far end of the storage unit, to the metal shelving where she had stored a laptop in a waterproof case alongside 3 prepaid phones and a notebook she had been filling for the better part of a year. She took the notebook out and set it on the work table that served this half of the unit as a surface. She opened it to a page near the middle. Dorian followed her. Petra came too, and she didn't stop him. Petra had earned the right to this conversation tonight in the most direct way possible. The notebook page had a name at the top, written in her handwriting, underlined twice. Below it were dates, transactions, an account number she had traced through 4 layers of shell before it resolved into something recognizable, and 3 photographs printed on regular paper, grainy, slightly soft, but unmistakable. Dorian looked at the name. His face went through something she had no word for. That's not... He stopped himself, started again. You're sure? I'm sure. Cassian has been with this family since he was 19 years old. I brought him in myself. I trained him myself. His voice was flat and careful, and she could hear what was underneath it. Not disbelief, but the specific grief of a man who believes a thing he doesn't want to believe. He's blood. He's been routing money to a Drago subsidiary for 14 months. The account number traces back through a property holding in Nevada that appears clean until the 3rd layer, when it connects to an LLC registered in the name of a woman named Drago, maiden name, from before she married into the family. She turned the page. More figures. Another photograph. He's the one who introduced you to Vivian. Do you remember how that happened? The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Charity event, Dorian said slowly. The Pemberton Foundation dinner. Cassian was on the organizing committee. He was on the organizing committee because she needed a way into your orbit that didn't look arranged. He arranged it for her. And he spent the last 8 months making sure that every time you started to question anything, there was a reason for you to question me instead. She looked at him steadily. The jealous wife. The irrational woman who couldn't accept reality. He fed you that story and you believed it because it was easier than believing the alternative. Dorian's right hand was flat on the table. She could see the tendons in it, the controlled stillness that meant the opposite of calm. Every security protocol from tonight, she said. The earpiece frequencies, the positioning of your men, the secondary safe house locations. She waited. He helped design all of it. Yes, Dorian said. His voice had gone somewhere very quiet. Which means whoever is running the federal unit outside the Meridian tonight knew every counter-surveillance measure you had in place. Not because they were good enough to break it, because someone gave them the answers. Dex, who had been quiet in the corner with his back to the wall and his eyes moving between the people in the room, said, "He's still out there." Everyone looked at him. "In the parking garage," Dex said. "On the camera feed. He was coordinating. He's still in play." He paused. "He doesn't know we got out." The significance of that settled over the room like a change in air pressure. Cassian Vescari believed that the night had gone as planned. He believed that Dorian was either captured or cornered. He believed that Celine had been expelled from the building before the shooting started and was therefore irrelevant. He was standing in the wreckage of an operation he had spent over a year building, and he thought it was working. He didn't know that the woman he had dismissed as a jealous wife was sitting in a storage unit on the west side with a notebook full of his transactions, a gun, and her husband, alive, listening to every word she said. Celine closed the notebook. "We have one advantage," she said. "Cassian doesn't know what we have, and he doesn't know we have it. The moment he finds out Dorian is alive and out of the building, that advantage disappears." She looked at Dorian. "Which means we have a window, a short one, and we have to decide right now what we do with it." Dorian was looking at her with something she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't the dismissal. That was gone. Whatever version of it remained was buried under the rubble of tonight. It wasn't the performed attention he used in public, the managed focus of a man deciding what he wanted you to think he was thinking. It was something rawer than both of those. Something she might have recognized from the early years if she hadn't spent so long learning not to look for it. "What do you want to do?" he asked. The question landed differently than she expected. Not because it was concessive, though it was, but because of the specific shape of it. Not what do we do? What do you want to do? As if he was finally, at cost that could not be calculated, acknowledging that her judgment was a thing that existed and mattered and had been right when his had been catastrophically wrong. She thought about the ballroom, about the stage, about the precise moment when she had stood with 200 eyes on her and given them nothing. She thought about Cassian in the parking garage, coordinating the aftermath of a plan he believed was unfolding correctly. She thought about Vivian Cross, who was somewhere in this city or out of it, who had served her purpose and was probably discovering right now what happened to Tools when the job was done. "Cassian doesn't just need to be stopped," Celine said. "He needs to be exposed. If we just take him out, the Drago Alliance absorbs the operation and we're back to fighting a war on the same terms we've been losing on." She straightened. "We need every crime family that was in that ballroom tonight to know exactly what he did. Not because we tell them, because we can prove it." She tapped the notebook. "This is enough, but I need access to one more account, one that Cassian doesn't know I've been tracking." "Which account?" Dorian asked. She told him the number. He went still. It wasn't the stillness of a man who didn't recognize what he was hearing. It was the stillness of a man who recognized it completely and was now understanding what that recognition cost him. Because the account she had just described was not Cassian's. It was older than Cassian's involvement. It predated Vivian by 3 years and predated the Drago connection by more. It was an account that had been moving money in small, careful amounts for so long that it had become invisible through sheer familiarity, the way a sound in a house becomes inaudible after you've lived with it long enough. It belonged to someone Dorian had trusted even longer than he had trusted Cassian. And from the way the color was leaving his face, standing in this storage unit in the west side of Chicago with his wife's handwriting across a notebook page that was dismantling every version of the last decade he had allowed himself to believe, Celine understood that he already knew whose name she was going to say next. The name she said was Harlan Vescari, Dorian's uncle, 71 years old, the man who had built the Romano Syndicate's financial infrastructure over 4 decades, who had taught Dorian the difference between money that was clean and money that only looked clean, who had sat at every family table and every strategy meeting, and every funeral for as long as anyone in the organization could remember. The man Dorian had described, more than once, as the only person in the world he trusted without qualification. The silence after she said it lasted long enough that Torres shifted in the back of the car and made a sound, and nobody looked at him. Dorian's face had gone past pale into something that had no good word for it, the specific physiological response of a man whose architecture is being demolished while he's still standing inside it. The jaw tight, the eyes unfocused by a millimeter, the right hand still flat on the table and pressing harder than it had been. "Show me," he said. She opened the notebook to the last section, turned it toward him. He looked at the figures for a long time without speaking. She watched him read the account number, trace the transaction dates with his eyes, arrive at the amounts and the intervals and the pattern that the amounts and intervals made when you looked at them the way she had looked at them. Not as isolated events, but as a language, a grammar of concealment that became legible once you knew what it was trying to hide. "This could be legitimate," he said. His voice had the quality of a man arguing with himself rather than with her. "Keep reading." He turned the page. The third photograph was there, the one she had held back from the earlier section because she had known she would need it for exactly this moment. Harlan Viscari and Lucian Drago, standing outside a building in downtown Milwaukee, the timestamp on the photograph 14 months old, 3 weeks before the first money moved through the account she had just identified. Dorian looked at the photograph for a very long time. Petra, beside the door, had stopped pretending he wasn't listening. "He introduced Cassian to Drago," Celine said. Not a question. She had worked that part out 2 weeks ago and had been sitting with it since, turning it over, checking it from different angles, looking for the version of events where it meant something less catastrophic. There wasn't one. Cassian didn't find his way to the Drago Alliance on his own. He was walked there, by someone he trusted, by someone who knew how to make a younger man feel like he was being given an opportunity rather than being recruited. Harlan wouldn't... Dorian stopped himself again. "Harlan has been planning this longer than Cassian has been part of it," she said. "Cassian is the instrument, Harlan is the hand. And the reason you never saw it is because Harlan spent 40 years making himself into the most indispensable person in this organization, and indispensable people don't get looked at closely." She held his gaze. "That's what the money is. That's what the Pemberton dinner was. That's what Vivian was. Harlan designed the entire structure. Cassian executed the parts that needed to be executed in person." Dex said quietly from his corner. "If Harlan is running this, then the federal unit outside the Meridian tonight has sources inside the organization that go back further than anything Cassian alone could have given them," Celine said. Yes. The room reassembled itself around that fact. She could see it happening in the faces of the men around her. Petra's controlled composure developing a hairline fracture, Dex's careful stillness becoming something more effortful, Torres managing pain in the back seat, while also processing the information drifting to him from the front of the unit, Renner by the wall with his damaged arm hanging and his expression doing the slow arithmetic of a man realizing how far the contamination went. Dorian closed the notebook, placed both hands flat on it, breathed. She had seen him in bad situations before. She had seen him under physical threat, under financial pressure, under the specific stress of organizational decisions that had no clean outcome. She had never seen him look like this, like the ground under the ground had given way, like the betrayal was not a thing that had happened to him from outside, but a thing that had been growing inside the walls for longer than he had been paying attention. "Where is Harlan right now?" he asked. "I don't know." His eyes came up. "I know where he was 3 days ago," she said. "I don't know where he went after the gala was announced. If he's smart, and he is, he's not in Chicago tonight." She reached for the prepaid phone and switched it on for the first time. "But Cassian is, and Cassian is the thread we can pull." "If we pull it," Dorian said, "and Harlan finds out we know, he already has contingencies. He's had them for years." She looked at him steadily. "The question is whether our contingency is better than his." Dorian was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Petra. "The safe house on Wentworth, the one that's not on any list Cassian had access to." Petra nodded slowly. It's old. Harlan might know it. Harlan knows all the old ones, Dorian said. The flatness in his voice when he said his uncle's name was a new kind of sound. She had never heard him use that register for Harlan before. We need something that doesn't exist in anyone's records. Celine. He looked at her. You rented this unit. Under a clean name. Yes. Do you have somewhere else like it? She did. She had 3. She had built them the way she had built everything over the last 18 months. Methodically, quietly, in the spaces between the things people expected her to be paying attention to. She told him about the one on Ashland Avenue. He listened without interrupting, which was more than she could say for any conversation they'd had in the last 2 years. They moved at 2 in the morning. The Ashland Avenue location was a commercial unit above a dry cleaning business, accessible through a side stairwell that didn't connect to the main building entrance. It smelled like solvent and dust, and the particular staleness of a space that existed without being occupied. Celine had a folding table in there, 4 chairs, a second laptop, and enough food and water for 3 days. She had been hoping she would never see it. Torres made it up the stairs with help. Renner's arm was worse than it had been, the kind of worse that happened when adrenaline wore off and the body remembered what had been done to it. She gave him what was in the medical kit and told him to sit, and he sat. By 3 in the morning, Dorian had reached 2 of his men through a channel that Selene had specifically kept off the Cassian-connected infrastructure, an older communication method, analog and slow, and exactly right for a situation where digital meant compromised. The men came in separately, 40 minutes apart, and both of them had the tight controlled look of people who had survived the night at significant cost and hadn't finished processing it yet. The first was a man named Galt, 50 years old, the kind of face that suggested a life lived primarily in the problem-solving register. The second was a woman named Ida Marsh, not a name most people outside the organization's financial layer would recognize, because Ida Marsh worked in a part of the Vescary structure that most people in the organization didn't know existed. She handled the accounts that handled the accounts. She was 53, small, wore glasses she kept pushing up her nose with her index finger, and she looked at Celine's notebook with the focused attention of someone for whom numbers were a first language. "Give me an hour with this," Ida said. "You have 40 minutes," Celine told her. Ida pushed her glasses up and started reading. While Ida worked, Dorian took Galt to the far corner of the room, and they spoke in low voices for 10 minutes. Celine did not try to hear what was said. She trusted, and this was a new kind of trust, rebuilt from necessity rather than affection, that whatever Dorian was doing in that corner was pointed in the right direction. She had given him the picture. What he did with it was the part that still required him to be what he was. She sat by the window and looked at the street below, and let herself feel, for the first time since the ballroom, the full weight of the night. Not the action of it. The action had been manageable, had in fact been the part she was most prepared for. The weight of it was something else. The weight was Dorian saying her name the way he'd said it on the hotel stage, the dismissal so complete it had been almost impersonal. The weight was 6 months of trying to reach him. The weight was the specific loneliness of being right in a way that you couldn't make anyone believe until the thing you were warning them about had already happened. She did not cry. She had done her crying in private, months ago, in small and controlled amounts, and she was finished with that particular process. What she felt now was not grief, but something colder and more structural, the sensation of a decision clarifying. She was still examining that sensation when Ida said, across the room, "There's a second set of books." Everyone looked at her. Ida had the notebook open and the laptop open beside it, and was looking at both with an expression of professional affront, as if the numbers had personally offended her. "The account your wife identified," she said this to Dorian without looking up, "is a conduit. The money doesn't stop there. It moves through at least 2 more layers before it reaches the actual receiving structure." She tapped the laptop screen. "I found the second layer about 20 minutes ago. The third layer took me another 15 minutes because whoever set it up used a legitimate charitable organization as a pass-through, one that your organization has actually donated to 3 times in the last 5 years, which is either a coincidence or a very deliberate piece of irony." "What's in the third layer?" Celine asked. Ida looked at her over the glasses. That's what I've been trying to determine, and what I found is... She paused, and the pause had the quality of someone choosing how to say a thing rather than whether to say it. The receiving entity is not the Drago organization. The room was very quiet. The final destination of this money, accumulated over 4 years, we're talking about significant capital here, well into 8 figures, is a holding structure registered in the Cayman Islands. The beneficial owner of that structure is listed as a trust. She looked at Dorian now, directly, with the particular steadiness of a person delivering information they know will change the room. The trust is named for a woman called Adele Fontaine Vescari. Dorian's whole body went rigid. Celine watched him. She did not know that name. She could see from the reaction that it mattered enormously, and she filed that observation immediately alongside everything else she had been filing tonight. But she did not know the name, and so she waited. It was Petra who said it, from his position by the door. He said it quietly, with the tone of someone who understood they were confirming the worst version of something. That was Dorian's mother's name, before she married into the family. Celine looked at Dorian. Dorian was looking at the middle distance with the specific expression of a man who had been hit somewhere he didn't know could be reached. Not his uncle. His uncle was devastation enough. A betrayal from outside the innermost circle, from a trusted mentor, from a man who had shaped him. But this was something different. This was money being moved, for 4 years, into a structure that used his dead mother's name as its legal identity. A woman who had died when Dorian was 17. A woman whose name Harlan had known because Harlan had been there for all of it, the whole of Dorian's life, the trusted constant in every version of the story Dorian had told himself about who he was and where he came from. He used her name, Dorian said. His voice was barely there. Nobody said anything. He built the structure around her name, so that if anyone ever traced it, he stopped, started again, so that if anyone ever found it, the name would stop them. Because anyone who knew me would know I wouldn't look past that name. I wouldn't be able to look past it. He pressed the heel of his hand against the table. He used it as a shield. Celine said, carefully, "Dorian." He looked at her. His eyes were red at the edges, not from crying, from the specific physiological stress of containment, of holding something enormous inside a space that was not designed for it. "That's not all Ida found," she said. Ida pushed her glasses up. "The trust has 2 beneficiaries. Harlan Vescari is one." She paused. Cassian Vescari is the other. Equal shares. The structure was established 4 years ago, 3 months after Harlan attended a private meeting in Geneva that I found reference to in a correspondence file I accessed through the secondary account. She looked at Celine. "You were right about the timing. This predates Vivian by nearly 3 years. It predates the federal surveillance increase by 18 months. This was not a reaction to an opportunity. This was the opportunity. Harlan created the conditions and then populated them." "He created Cassian's ambition," Celine said, "or cultivated it, gave it direction and funding and cover, and in return Cassian did the visible work, the relationships, the positioning, the affair, the gala." She looked at Dorian. Harlan never had to be in the room for any of it. He was never going to be in the room for any of it. When the dust settled, Cassian takes the empire and Harlan takes the money, and they both have exactly what they wanted While I was dead, Dorian said. The word landed in the room without cushioning. "Yes," Celine said. Galt had been listening from his corner with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man working a very large calculation. Now he said, "If Harlan is positioned outside Chicago, and Cassian is still operational inside, they'll make contact once Cassian confirms the status from tonight, which means Cassian is going to find out, probably within the next few hours, that Dorian is not where he's supposed to be. And when Cassian finds out Dorian is alive," Dex said, "Harlan disappears permanently." "Not just disappears," Ida said, without looking up from the laptop. "The holding structure has a liquidation protocol. I found the trigger mechanism in the correspondence file. If a specific condition is met, and based on what I'm reading, the condition appears to be the death or confirmed capture of Dorian Vescari, the trust structure automatically begins liquidating its assets and redistributing through 4 additional entities over a 72-hour window. She looked up. Once that process starts, the money becomes essentially untraceable within 48 hours and completely unreachable within 72. So if Cassian finds out Dorian is alive, Celine said, he doesn't trigger the liquidation. He tries again. Yes, Ida said. But if Cassian goes dark, if he can't confirm the outcome either way, Harlan might trigger it himself as a precaution. Celine looked at the clock on the wall. 4:17 in the morning. They had at most until Cassian made contact with Harlan and gave an update. Could be an hour, could be 3. Cassian was disciplined enough to wait for a clean communication window, which bought them time, but not much. We can't let Cassian go dark, she said. We need him to make contact with Harlan, and we need that contact to not trigger the liquidation. She was thinking as she spoke, assembling the pieces with the speed that the situation required. Which means Cassian needs to believe when he makes contact that the situation is still under control. You want to use Cassian to reach Harlan, Dorian said. I want to use the communication between them to get to Harlan's location before he has any reason to run. And how do we make Cassian believe the situation is under control? She looked at him, at his cut eyebrow and his bruised jaw and the specific exhaustion behind his eyes that was not physical, or not only physical, but the exhaustion of a man who had spent the last 6 hours having his world taken apart from the foundation. Cassian is going to find out you're alive, she said. We can't prevent that, but we can control when he finds out and what he knows when he does. She straightened. I need access to one of the Viscari communication channels, not a compromised one, something that Cassian monitors but doesn't control. Dorian was already looking at Galt. Something moved between them, some shorthand built from years of working in close proximity to each other. Galt nodded once. The Channel 4 line, Galt said. Cassian has eyes on it, but the encryption key rotates every 6 hours and the last rotation was at midnight. He'll trust traffic that comes through on this cycle. Then here's what we do, Celine said. She laid it out. Not quickly. Quickly was how you introduced errors, and errors at this stage were the difference between a plan and a disaster. She laid it out with the methodical care of someone who had been thinking about the structure of this family's vulnerabilities for a very long time, from the inside, from the vantage point of a person who had been dismissed as peripheral and had therefore been present for things that people with power rarely witness, the unguarded moments, the careless conversations, the places where the architecture had cracks that nobody had bothered to seal because nobody had bothered to look. She was still in the middle of laying it out when the first thing went wrong. Renner's phone, the one he shouldn't have had, the personal phone she had specifically told everyone to disable 3 hours ago, lit up on the crate beside him with a screen notification. She saw it from across the room. She saw the name on the screen from across the room because the room was small and the font was large, and the name was one she recognized. Cassian. The room froze. Renner looked at the phone. He looked at it with the specific paralysis of a man who did not expect what he was seeing, who had not prepared a response for this moment, whose face was doing something involuntary and complicated that had nothing to do with the composed professional competence he had been performing all night. Celine understood before she consciously understood. It arrived in her body first. The cold drop through the center of her chest, the sudden sharpness of every detail in the room, the way Renner's damaged arm was held, the way he was sitting, the specific location of his position in the room relative to the door, the fact that he had been there, present, in the service tunnel, at exactly the right moment to join them. And she had not asked herself why he had known which tunnel to use, had simply accepted his presence as one of the night's variables. She had not asked herself who had told the gunman which stairwells to cover. She had not asked herself why Renner's communication was still active when everyone else's had gone out. "Renner," she said. He looked at her. The phone was still lit. Cassian's name still on the screen, and in Renner's face, under the performance of surprise, under the accumulated construction of a man who was very good at being trustworthy, she saw the exact moment when he understood that she had already arrived at the answer. His hand moved toward the phone. Dorian moved faster. What followed was not clean. It was the opposite of clean. Furniture, impact, The sound of two large men in a confined space making contact with each other and with every hard surface available. Torres yelling from the corner where he couldn't move, Dex coming off the wall, and Petra crossing the room in 4 steps. Galt had his weapon out and aimed at Renner's center mass before Renner's hand had closed around the phone, and the room was suddenly configured around that gun the way rooms configured around guns. Everything stopped, everything recalculated, everyone breathing with deliberate care. Renner was on his back on the floor with Dorian's knee on his chest, and Galt's weapon pointed at his face. Celine picked up the phone. She looked at the message from Cassian. It was 4 words and a question mark. Confirm status. Are we good? She looked at Renner. His face had resolved into something that was not fear exactly, or not only fear. It was the face of a man who had run a calculation and arrived at the answer that the calculation was over. How long? She asked him. He didn't answer. How long have you been with Cassian? Nothing. Did you know about the gala? Did you know what tonight was supposed to be? She kept her voice level. She was aware of Dorian above Renner, of the specific tension in Dorian's body that was restraint applied to something that wanted very badly to not be restrained. I need to know what Cassian knows about this location. Still nothing. Dorian leaned down. He said something to Renner very quietly, so quietly that she couldn't hear the words, only the quality of them, which was the quality of a man who has spent 20 years making people understand that he means what he says. She had heard that quality before. She had never had it directed at her, and she had spent a long time being grateful for that. Renner said, "He doesn't know this location. I didn't have time to transmit before you found me in the tunnel." A pause. The sound of someone deciding that a partial truth was the most strategic version of cooperation available. I was trying to find a window. Was there anyone else? Renner's eyes moved. She caught it. The microsecond shift toward the door, not the physical door, but the direction of it. The instinctive tell of a man whose mind went to another person when asked the question. She looked at Petra. Petra was standing by the door with his weapon at his side and his face arranged into an expression of controlled attention that she had seen on him all night and had read as professionalism. She looked at that expression now with the fresh information of Renner's eye movement, and she began to see the seams in it, the places where the control was too precise, where the professionalism was a layer rather than a foundation. Petra looked back at her. In the silence between them, something passed that was not a word and not a gesture, but the pure transfer of recognition. She saw him seeing that she knew, and he saw her seeing it, and for one suspended second neither of them moved. Then Petra's weapon came up, and Celine was already moving because she had learned in the last 6 hours that the distance between knowing something and acting on it could not have any space in it at all, and she was done leaving space. The gun came up and Celine was already moving, and the two things happened in the same instant, which was the only reason the first shot went into the wall behind her instead of through her. She went left and down, the way the floor presented itself as the only geography that mattered, her shoulder hitting concrete with a force that would leave something broken or badly bruised. But that information was filed for later, because later was a concept that required surviving the next 4 seconds first. She could hear the room reorganizing around the shot. Torres shouting, Dex coming off the wall to the right. Dorian's voice saying something that wasn't a word, just a sound. The specific vocalization of a man who has processed a threat and is already responding to it before language catches up. Petra fired again. The second shot was better aimed and hit the metal shelving behind where she had been standing, and the sound of it in the enclosed space was enormous. The kind of sound that reset every nervous system in the room to pure reflex. Galt shot Petra. Not a kill shot. Galt was too controlled for the kill shot in a room this size with this many bodies, but through the shoulder, high and back, and Petra went sideways into the door with a sound that was more impact than cry. The weapon dropped. Petra's hand went to his shoulder with the automatic gesture of a body responding to damage, and for 3 seconds he was down to one functional arm and one operational thought, which was survival. Celine was on her feet before those 3 seconds were finished. She crossed the room and picked up Petra's gun from the floor and put herself between it and him and stood there with both weapons, her borrowed compact and Petra's heavier piece, and looked at him against the door, breathing in the hard, shallow rhythm of someone working through significant pain. Dorian was still across the room with Renner, and from the sound of it, Renner was no longer a mobile problem. Dex had covered Torres, which was the right instinct. Ida had not moved from the table, which suggested a quality of composure under fire that Celine would think about later, in whatever version of later existed. "How many?" she said to Petra. He looked at her. His face was very white above the shoulder wound, the kind of white that meant the blood was going somewhere it shouldn't. "How many people does Cassian have watching this block?" Petra's jaw was working. She could see the calculation running behind his eyes. The specific arithmetic of a man weighing what cooperation cost against what silence cost and trying to determine which number was smaller. "3," he said. "On the street. 2 more in a vehicle on the north end." "Did you transmit our location before we got here?" A pause that was its own answer. "When we were in the storage unit," she said, "you had a window while I was working on Torres." He said nothing, which meant yes. She looked at Dorian. He was looking back at her with an expression that had shed every layer of everything else and was down to the stripped-down thing underneath. The part of him that had built an empire from nothing by being willing to act in the moments when other men were still deciding. "We have minutes," she said. "Maybe less." He was already moving. Galt. "Ready." "Dex, can Torres walk?" "If I'm under him," Dex said, "then be under him." Dorian looked at Ida. "You. Everything on that laptop. Can you send it anywhere?" Ida had already been doing something on the keyboard. Encrypted transfer to an external server. Already running. She pushed her glasses up. 90 seconds. "You have 60. He looked at Celine. She was already reading the room for the exit geometry. The window on the south side that she had marked when they arrived, the rooftop access 2 floors up, the alley access below. She went to the window and looked down. The street was still. Still in the way that streets were still when the people in them were trying to look like they weren't there. She could see one of them, a man in a dark jacket on the east side of the street, standing with his back to a doorway in the specific posture of someone who wanted to look like he was waiting for someone. She clocked the angle of his body, the direction he was watching, the earpiece she could see from 2 floors up because she was looking for it. "South exit is covered," she said. "Rooftop?" Dorian asked. "Maybe. Depends how many he actually sent." Galt said, "If Petra transmitted our location from the storage unit, Cassian had time to mobilize more than 5. "Yes," Celine said. "He did." She turned from the window. "We're not going out. We're making them come in." Dorian looked at her. "We let them come to us," she said. "Controlled environment. We know the layout. They're entering blind. We take one of them intact and we use him to send Cassian a message that brings Cassian here instead of sending more men." She looked around the room. "And then we end this tonight." The silence lasted about 2 seconds. "You want to use this room as a trap," Dorian said. "I want to use their certainty as a trap. They think we're cornered. Cornered people make predictable choices. We make the choice they're expecting, and we do it on our terms." She was moving as she spoke, going to the shelving on the back wall, looking at what she had stored there for the specific contingency of needing to make a room inhospitable on short notice. "Ida. How long?" 30 seconds. Galt. "The window on the north side. Tell me what you see." Galt crossed to it. "Vehicle on the corner. 2 men visible. Engine running. They're waiting for a signal from the men on the street. Petra was supposed to transmit once we were settled." She looked at Petra, still against the door, bleeding through his fingers where his hand pressed his shoulder. "How long before Cassian expects confirmation?" Petra's face. The calculation again. 10 minutes from when we arrived here, maybe less." She checked the clock. They had 4 minutes, possibly 3. "Ida?" "Done." Ida closed the laptop, pulled a drive from the side of it. "Everything is off-site. The drive is clean." "Put it in your coat and don't lose it." Celine looked at Dorian. "Torres and Ida go up. Rooftop access, northeast corner. There's a fire escape that connects to the building next door. Dex takes them. You, me, and Galt stay." Dorian said, "And Renner?" She looked at Renner, zip-tied to the leg of the work table with a section of the extension cord she'd found on the shelving. He was conscious, watching the room with the specific alertness of someone who had accepted his position and was now auditing his options. "Renner stays," she said. "He's the message." Dorian absorbed that, nodded once. Dex got Torres upright with the efficiency of someone who had made a physical commitment and was honoring it. Torres was gray-faced and breathing through his teeth, but his legs were working, which was the minimum requirement. Ida went with them without being told twice. The woman had an instinct for which instruction to follow and when to follow it that Celine found deeply reassuring. They went up through the interior stairwell, and the sounds of them diminished and then stopped. 3 minutes became 2. Celine positioned Galt at the interior door, the one that led from the stairwell landing into the room, with the instruction to wait for the third person through before he did anything. She positioned herself at the south window, which had the widest angle on the entry approach, and which she could use without showing herself if she stayed back from the glass. She kept Petra's heavier weapon and gave her compact to Dorian, who took it without comment. Dorian stood in the center of the room. She looked at him standing there and thought about what he was doing, the particular courage of it. Not the physical courage, which was native to him and which she had never doubted, but the other kind. The kind that required standing in a room where the last 3 hours had stripped every certainty he possessed and operating anyway, with what remained, in the direction she had pointed. He looked at her across the room. She looked back. Neither of them said anything. There wasn't anything to say that the last 3 hours hadn't already said. She heard them on the stairs at 2 minutes and 40 seconds. 3 sets of footsteps, which told her Petra had been telling the truth about the number, or at least about this portion of it. They were moving with the confidence of people who expected a contained situation, who had been told the occupants were unaware of the incoming approach, which meant Petra's transmission had characterized their position as secure. They were coming in expecting to find people who didn't know they were coming. That expectation was the most valuable thing in the room. The door came in hard. The specific entry technique of trained men who wanted to take the hinges out of the calculation. And the first 2 were through before the third had cleared the frame. Galt took the third before he was fully inside, the controlled efficiency of someone who had been told to wait for the third and had waited exactly that long. The sound of it was close and brutal in the small room. The first 2 recalibrated in the half-second available to them, which was a half-second less than they needed. Dorian was already inside the first man's reach, too close for the weapon to be useful, which was where Dorian had always been most dangerous, in the space where size and experience converted into leverage and impact. The second man swung toward Celine's position, and she was not where he expected her to be, which gave her the angle she needed. The fight lasted under 20 seconds. When it was over, all 3 men were down, one of them badly enough that Celine made a fast assessment and told Galt to apply pressure to the leg, which he did without asking why. The other 2 were functional enough to be useful. She went to the one who looked like he was senior. The way you identified the senior man was the same in every context. He was the one who had positioned himself last through the door, the one who let the others take the first exposure. She crouched in front of him. He was on the floor with his back against the wall, and his wrists secured behind him, and his face doing the careful neutral of someone waiting to see what the situation required. "I'm going to ask you one thing," she said, "and I need you to think carefully about the answer, because the answer determines what happens in the next hour." He looked at her, said nothing. "Is Cassian Vescari coming here himself, or is he sending more men?" A beat. "More men. How many?" "I don't know the number." "When?" "When I don't check in." She looked at the clock. 2 minutes since they'd come through the door. "You're already late." "Yeah," he said. "Call him." His expression shifted. Not surprise, but the recalibration of someone who had expected a different kind of conversation. "And say what?" "Tell him it's clean. Tell him the subjects are secured and you need a collection vehicle." She held his gaze. "Tell him to come himself." "Cassian doesn't come himself." "Tell him Dorian is here, and he's alive, and you have him." She watched the man's face process that. "That will bring him himself." The man looked past her to where Dorian was standing. Dorian looked back at him with the expression of a man who was not performing anything. "He'll know it's a setup," the man said. "Maybe," Celine said, "but he's been waiting 4 years to confirm that Dorian Viscari is in his hands. That's not a thing a man like Cassian delegates. That's the moment he's been building toward, and he knows there's no rebuilding it if he misses it." She let that land. "Call him." The man was quiet for a long moment. She could see him running the numbers. Not loyalty numbers, those were a different calculation, but survival numbers. The specific arithmetic of a man who had been on the losing side of a situation and was trying to identify the least costly version of what came next. "If I do this," he said, "what happens to me?" "You walk out of this room when it's over," she said. "That's the offer." He looked at her for another 3 seconds. Then he said, "I need my phone." Galt found it on him and held it while the man made the call. The conversation was 40 seconds long. The man's voice was controlled enough that she was watching his hands the entire time for the signal that he was transmitting something different than what he was saying. His hands were still. When the call ended, he looked at her. "He's coming. 20 minutes. "Where?" "He said here. He'll call when he's a block out." She stood, looked at Dorian. 20 minutes. Dorian said, "He won't come alone." "No," she agreed. "He'll bring 4 to 6 men, enough to feel protected, not so many that it looks like he's unsure." She went to the window. The street below had changed. The man in the dark jacket was gone from the east doorway, which meant the approach was being cleared from Cassian's side, which meant he was already moving. "He'll take the main entrance. It's what he knows. So we can't use this room." "No," she said. "We can't use this room." She had been thinking about it since she said Cassian was coming, had been laying out the geometry in her head while the phone call was happening, and there was only one answer that accounted for all the variables. It was not the answer she would have chosen if she'd had more time or more people or more of anything. It was the answer the situation generated when you applied honest mathematics to it. "The dry cleaning business downstairs," she said. "Ground floor. It has a loading area in the back with 2 access points. If we're in position before he arrives—" "He'll sweep before he enters," Dorian said. "Yes, so we need to be in position before the sweep." She looked at the clock. "We have 17 minutes and we need to move in the next 3. Torres and Ida are on the roof. They stay on the roof until I send Dex the signal." She had a prepaid phone that was still dark. She turned it on. "Dex has the number." Dorian was looking at her with that look again. The one she couldn't fully name. The one that had been building since the service corridor of the Meridian. He said, "You planned for this." "I planned for needing to draw someone into a space I controlled," she said. "I didn't plan for it being Cassian specifically. I planned for the possibility that whoever was behind this might need to be brought to us rather than us going to them." She held his gaze. "I've been planning for possibilities for a long time." He absorbed it the way he had been absorbing things all night. Not with the resistance she had spent years encountering when she tried to reach him, but with the specific gravity of a man who had run out of reasons to deflect. "Let's go," he said. The dry cleaning business was dark and solvent-smelling and larger than it looked from the street. The loading area in the back was a concrete space 30 feet deep with shelving along both walls and a central channel wide enough for a delivery vehicle. The 2 access points were a roll door on the south face and a personnel door on the east side. She chose their positions based on the sightlines and communicated them to Dorian and Galt in the compressed shorthand of people who no longer needed to explain their reasoning to each other. They had 11 minutes. Celine took the east side, behind the last row of shelving, where she had a line of sight to both doors and the central channel between them. The floor was cold under her knees when she settled into position. Her shoulder, from the fall in the room above, was announcing itself with increasing insistence. She ignored it with the practice of someone who had learned that pain was information, not instruction, and the information was already filed. She heard her own heartbeat in the silence, even, measured. She had expected it to be faster. At 9 minutes, Dorian's phone, the one they'd taken from their captive upstairs, received a text. 1 block out. She passed the information to Galt with a hand signal and settled deeper behind the shelving and made herself into something still. At 6 minutes, she heard the front of the building. The sweep was professional and brief. 2 men through the main floor, moving with flashlights whose beams swept under and over in the systematic pattern of people who had done this before. They checked the stairwell access. They checked the back of the main space. They did not check the loading area because the loading area door was closed, and their job was to confirm the building was clear, not to investigate every potential hiding place. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a thorough search and a time-pressured sweep. They were gone in 4 minutes. Cassian came in at the 3-minute mark. She heard his voice before she heard his footsteps. Low, directed, the voice of a man giving instructions to the men around him. She counted footsteps. 4 additional men. So 6 total, with Cassian. She had been right about the number. She heard him moving through the main space, heard him on the stairs, heard, distantly, the sounds of him finding the room above, finding Renner, finding the 2 secured men, finding the evidence of the fight and the absence of Dorian. The silence that followed was short. Then his footsteps on the stairs again, coming down, moving faster. The specific rhythm of a man whose calculation has changed and who is now operating on a different set of assumptions. He came through the loading area door at speed, 2 men ahead of him, flashlights cutting through the darkness in wide arcs. Celan pressed flat behind the shelving and watched through a gap between metal uprights as the flashlight beams moved across the central channel, across the far wall, across the roll door that was closed and dark. Cassian stopped in the center of the space. She could see him clearly enough, 40 years old. The family resemblance to Dorian was there in the jaw and the shoulders, softened by something that was either comfort or calculation. A man who had spent years presenting himself as the affable younger cousin, the one who wasn't a threat, the one you brought into the room because he made the room easier. He was still in the suit he had worn to the gala. He had a weapon in his right hand, and his eyes were moving through the darkness with the focus of someone who has been in enough bad situations to know when he's in another one. "Dorian," Cassian said, "to the darkness, to the whole room. I know you're here. Nothing. I know she got you out. I know she had the tunnel access and the cameras." A pause. "I want you to know I never underestimated her. I want you to know that. Every piece of this, the affair, the gala, the federal access, I built it with her in mind. I built it knowing she was smarter than you gave her credit for." Another pause. "The mistake I made was not building it knowing she was smarter than I gave her credit for." Celine stayed still. Cassian's voice was composed and conversational and had the quality of a man who was buying himself time while his eyes finished the work his flashlight hadn't. "Harlan is gone," Cassian said. "That's what I want you to understand before this ends. Whatever she found in those accounts, and I know she found them, she's been tracking them for 18 months. I know, because I've been watching her watch them. Whatever she has, it doesn't reach Harlan. He's been outside the country for 6 days. He's not coming back." He turned slowly in the center of the room. "So the idea that you can use me to get to him, that's not how this works. I'm the end of the road, Dorian. Whatever you're planning to do to me, you do, and Harlan is still gone, and the money is still gone, and you're still standing in a city where every organization that matters thinks you're finished." Celine looked through the gap in the shelving at the back of Cassian's head. At the 2 men ahead of him, flashlights still moving. At the 2 men behind him, covering the door they'd come through. At the 6th man, slightly to the left, positioned between Cassian and the roll door. She was counting positions. She was also listening to what Cassian was not saying. He had said Harlan was gone. He had said it twice, in 2 different constructions, with the specific emphasis of a man who wants you to believe something. And she believed that he believed it. She was not reading deception in his voice about Harlan's absence. She was reading something else, a gap, a piece of information he possessed that he had structured his speech around without mentioning. He knew where Harlan was, not because he'd told her, because of the particular way he'd avoided telling her while talking about everything adjacent to it. The same way a man would carefully not mention a room while describing every other room in a house. She looked at Dorian's position. She couldn't see him, but she knew where he was. the third upright from the east door, and she had told him to wait for her signal, and the signal was the sound of her voice saying one specific word. She had told him the word on the way down the stairs. Cassian was still talking. She had stopped processing the content and started processing the timing, looking for the rhythm of his speech that would tell her when he was about to transition from talking to acting, the moment when the monologue ended and the decision began. She heard it coming 3 sentences before it arrived, the slight compression in his delivery. The way his weight shifted, she could hear that too, in this silence, the subtle redistribution of a man preparing to move. "Enough," she said. Cassian spun toward her voice. Both men ahead of him swung their flashlights. She was not where the voice had been by the time the flashlights arrived. She had moved left as she spoke, 2 steps, and the beams caught empty shelving. In the same second, Dorian came out of position on the east side, and Galt came out of position behind the roll door. She had put him there 20 minutes ago specifically for this geometry. And the room reorganized itself around the presence of 3 threats instead of 1. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not clean, and it was not controlled, and it was nothing like the specific choreography of the plans she had laid out in the room above. It was the thing that happens when a plan meets reality, and reality wins on the details, while the plan holds on the structure. She took a hit across her left arm from something she didn't see coming, an elbow or a forearm fast and hard, and the arm went briefly useless. She switched the weapon to her right hand and kept moving. She heard Dorian. She knew the sound of him in a fight now, in a way she had never known it before tonight. The specific rhythm of his body under extreme physical stress. Somewhere to her left, and he was still moving, which meant he was still functional. She heard Galt's voice once, sharp and directive. She heard something large go over. She found Cassian at the roll door. He was trying to get it open. One of his men was already down. Another had broken for the personnel door and run into Galt's position. Cassian had his weapon up, and he was looking at her across 12 feet of concrete floor in the beam of a flashlight that had fallen and was pointing at the wall, casting everything in sideways angles and deep shadow. They looked at each other. His chest was moving hard. Hers was too. She could feel her left arm starting to come back, the nerves reporting damage but function, the arm not broken, which was information she needed. "You're not going to shoot me," Cassian said. "Why not?" "Because you need me to find Harlan." She looked at him, at the weapon in his hand, at the roll door behind him that was still closed, at the geometry of the space between them and the specific calculation it presented. "You're right," she said. "I do." She shot him in the right leg. He went down hard, the weapon leaving his hand and skittering across the concrete, and the sound he made when he hit the floor was the compound sound of pain and surprise, and the specific indignation of a man who has just had his most protected assumption invalidated. He grabbed his leg with both hands and looked up at her with an expression that was recalibrating at speed. She walked to him, picked up his weapon, stood over him. "We can do this one of 2 ways," she said. Her voice was steady. Her arm was not. "You can tell me where Harlan is, and I use what you tell me to take him in a way that's clean and documented and exposes the full structure to every family that needs to see it. Or you cannot tell me, and I let Dorian ask you." She tilted her head slightly. "I would recommend the first option." Cassian was breathing in the hard, wet rhythm of someone managing significant pain. His eyes were still calculating. She could see it, the machinery of it, the refusal to stop even now. "If I tell you," he said, "what happens to me?" "You survived tonight. That's the offer." She crouched in front of him, the way she had crouched in front of the man upstairs, the same level gaze and the same absence of performance. "Tonight is the only question on the table right now, Cassian. Tomorrow is a different conversation." He looked at her for a long moment. His hands were dark with blood below the knee, and his suit was ruined, and the empire he had spent 4 years positioning himself to inherit had resolved into 1,200 square feet of concrete floor in the middle of the night. And she could see all of that registering in his face alongside the calculation. Dorian appeared at her shoulder. She felt him there before she saw him. The presence of him, standing behind her and slightly left, and she could hear in his breathing that he had taken something too, somewhere, because the rhythm was compressed and careful in the way of controlled pain. Cassian looked past her at Dorian. Something moved between them. The 2 men, the 15 years of proximity, the version of trust that had been operational until tonight. She watched it collapse in real time across Cassian's face. Not remorse exactly. Something more primitive than remorse. The specific grief of a man looking at the cost of what he chose. Milwaukee, Cassian said. His voice was stripped down to its minimum. He has a property in Milwaukee, not in his name, in the name of a company called Saltern Group. He paused. He's been there since Tuesday. Celine looked at Ida's drive in her coat pocket, at the laptop upstairs, at the prepaid phone in her hand with Dex's number in it, and Dex on the roof with Torres and Ida and the encrypted files that contained everything they needed. She looked at Dorian. He was looking at Cassian with an expression that had no name in the language she had available to her. Then he looked at her, and what was in his eyes when he looked at her was the thing she had needed for 11 years and had stopped expecting and had finally, at a cost she could not yet fully calculate, arrived at the far side of. Milwaukee, he said. Tonight, she said. She stood up and sent the signal to Dex and began the process of ending this, because the window was closing and Harlan Viscari was 2 hours north of where she was standing, and she had not come this far to let the last piece of it disappear into the version of the story where the man who built everything wrong walked away clean while everything he built came down on the people who hadn't deserved it. She had not come this far for that. They drove to Milwaukee in 2 vehicles. Celine rode with Dorian in the gray sedan, Galt behind the wheel, the city falling away behind them as they took the interstate north through the last hours of the night. Dex followed in a vehicle Galt had arranged with a phone call so brief it suggested a long history of arrangements made under pressure. Torres was in the second vehicle, stabilized enough to move, not stable enough to be useful at the other end, which both he and Dex understood without it being said. Ida rode with them, the drive in her coat pocket, the encrypted files already transmitted to 3 separate servers in 2 countries. Celine sat in the back seat with her left arm braced against the door and watched the highway lights pass overhead in regular intervals, each one a brief white flare against the dark, and let herself think about what came next with the specific clarity that arrived only when the immediate crisis had resolved into something manageable. The arm was not broken. She had tested the range of motion in the loading area before they left, moving through it systematically while Galt secured the men who needed securing, and Dorian stood over Cassian and said things to him she wasn't close enough to hear. The arm moved. It cost her something every time it moved, but it moved. Dorian was in the back seat beside her, not touching. The distance between them was perhaps 18 inches, and it contained everything the night had produced. He hadn't spoken since they got in the car. She looked at the side of his face in the passing light. The eyebrow cut dark and crusted now, the jaw bruising fully developed, the specific exhaustion in his profile that was not the exhaustion of a man who needed sleep, but the exhaustion of a man who had been required to understand too many things in too short a time and was still processing the full inventory. She knew that look from a different angle. She had worn it herself, the first time she had opened a bank statement and seen a number that didn't belong there, and understood, slowly and then all at once, that the life she thought she was living had different walls than the ones she could see. "Vivienne," Dorian said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the windshield, at the highway unspooling ahead of them. "Where do you think she went?" Celine had thought about this. Drago's people will have pulled her out before the shooting started. She was an asset. You don't leave assets in the building when the building becomes a crime scene. She paused. "She's gone. Somewhere without an extradition agreement, probably, with whatever Drago paid her and whatever she managed to accumulate during the 8 months she was inside your orbit." Did she know what Cassian was planning? The massacre? I think she knew something was planned. I don't think she knew the scale of it. Celine considered this with the care it deserved, because it mattered to get it right even now, even about a woman who had been placed in her marriage like a splinter. She's a professional. She would have understood that she was being used for a specific purpose, and she would have been paid enough not to ask too many questions about what that purpose connected to. But Cassian needed her functional and motivated, which meant he needed her to believe she had agency in the situation. She looked at her hands in her lap. Nobody performs convincingly when they know they're disposable, so he probably let her think she mattered more than she did. Dorian absorbed this. a long quiet. Then, "She was good at it." "Yes," Celine said. "She was." There was no anger in her voice when she said it. She had discharged the anger over the months of sitting with it alone, of carrying the knowledge in the way you carried things nobody around you knew you were carrying, quietly, with both hands, watching your step. What remained was not forgiveness exactly, and not indifference either, but something more accurate than both. A clear-eyed accounting. "I should have listened to you," Dorian said. "Yes." "I knew something was wrong. I knew it before you ever tried to tell me. I knew it, and I chose—" He stopped. His hand on his thigh was flat and still and pressing. "I chose the version of reality that was easier." "I know," she said. "That's not an apology." "I know that too." He looked at her then. The highway light came through the window at an angle, and she could see his face in full. The damage of the night, and underneath it, the older damage, the years of a man who had built his entire identity on a certainty that had turned out to be a performance. He said, "I don't know how to apologize for 11 years. "You can't," she said. "You can't apologize for 11 years. You can only account for them." He held her gaze for a moment that had no other content in it. Then he looked back at the road, and she looked back at the passing lights, and they sat in the 18 inches of space that contained everything, and neither of them tried to fill it. The Saltern Group property was a converted industrial space on the western edge of Milwaukee, 3 miles from the lake, in the kind of neighborhood that had been something else once and was between identities now. Old warehousing, a few new developments, long blocks of quiet that had the quality of spaces people passed through rather than inhabited. The building had a residential component on the upper 2 floors and commercial-coded space below, the kind of arrangement that allowed for significant discretion about who came and went and when. They parked 2 blocks east at 4:47 in the morning. Galt had reached 2 additional men during the drive. Not from the main organization, from a separate network that Dorian had built over years specifically for situations where the main organization could not be trusted. They arrived at the staging point within minutes of each other, 2 men who had the particular quality of people who had been waiting for exactly this call for a long time. She did not ask their names. They did not offer them. Celine looked at the building from 2 blocks away and worked the geometry. 4 floors. 2 visible entry points from this angle. Lights on the 3rd floor only. 2 windows, the light steady rather than moving, which suggested occupation rather than search. A vehicle parked in the loading bay at the building's south face. Late model, clean, the specific inconspicuous quality of a vehicle chosen to not be remembered. "He's there," she said. Dorian was beside her. "Yes." "He'll have people with him. Not many. He thinks he's invisible here." She looked at the 3rd floor windows. "He's been invisible here for 6 days. He's comfortable." "Comfortable people are slow," Galt said. "Yes." She turned to the group, 5 of them functional, Torres staying with the vehicles because staying with the vehicles was what Torres could do, and doing it without complaint was the measure of him. "We go in on the south access. The loading bay door will be locked from inside. Galt, can you get through it?" "Give me 90 seconds. "You have 60. She looked at the 2 men whose names she didn't know. "3rd floor only. We don't go anywhere else until we've cleared the 3rd floor. She looked at Dorian. "He'll try to reason with you. He's going to say things that are designed to create hesitation." She held his gaze. "Don't let him." "I know who he is," Dorian said. His voice had the quality of something that had already been decided at depth, below the level where words operated. They moved. Galt got the loading bay door in 55 seconds. The interior of the building's ground floor was dark and smelled like disuse, concrete and old machinery, and the specific emptiness of a space that was maintained rather than used. They took the interior stairwell, moving in the practiced silence of people who understood that silence was the only advantage they had going in. 2nd floor. Dark. Clear. 3rd floor landing. The light was coming from under a door at the far end of a short corridor. Celine could hear something, not voices, not movement, but the ambient noise of occupation, the subtle sounds of a space that contained a person, the heat of habitation. They were halfway down the corridor when the door opened. The man who came out was not Harlan. He was young, wide-shouldered, and he processed the hallway full of people in under a second and went for the weapon at his hip in the same motion. What followed was short and close and left him on the floor of the corridor with Galt's knee on his back and his hands empty. He was breathing. She checked that specifically. A voice from inside the room. "Mace, what was that?" Celine pushed the door open. Harlan Vescari was standing at a table on the far side of the room, and she saw him register her face before he registered anything else. And the specific sequence of that, her first, then the men behind her, then the full understanding of what had arrived, was something she would remember for a long time. He was in his shirt sleeves. The suit jacket was over the back of a chair. There was a glass of something amber on the table beside a laptop and a phone, and the particular domestic arrangement of a man who had been waiting with the patience of someone confident in his own invisibility. He was 71 years old, and he had the posture of a man who had never fully relinquished the body he'd had at 40, the deliberate straightness of someone who had decided that the body was a performance, and the performance was non-negotiable. His face, when he saw Dorian come through the door behind Celine, was the most complicated thing she had seen all night, which was a high bar. "Dorian," Harlan said. Dorian did not say anything. Harlan's eyes moved to Celine. Something shifted in them. Not fear, or not only fear, but the specific recalibration of a man encountering a variable his model had not adequately accounted for. "You," he said. The word had the quality of a conclusion being reached rather than an accusation being made. "Me," she said. She moved to the table. He didn't step back from it, which she noted. The decision to hold his ground even now, the reflex of a man who had spent 50 years never being the one who stepped back. She looked at the laptop. The phone? The glass? The particular order of the surface, which told her he had been working, not waiting, actively managing something, which meant the liquidation process was already in some stage of initiation. She looked at Ida, who had come through the door last and was now crossing to the table with the directness of a woman who had been waiting to get her hands on exactly this. Ida sat down in front of the laptop without asking permission and started reading. Harlan watched her. "Whatever you think you're going to find, she's going to find the liquidation protocol," Celine said. "And she's going to stop it. And then she's going to document everything that's in that machine and send it to the same 3 servers that already have the account records, and the transaction history and the correspondence file from the Geneva meeting." She looked at him steadily. "And then every family that was in the Meridian Grand tonight is going to receive a package. And every federal contact you've spent 15 years cultivating is going to receive a package. And the documentation is going to be complete enough that the story it tells has no version where you're anything other than what you are." Harlan was quiet. The kind of quiet that was not absence of thought, but the opposite. "Cashin, he said. Not a question. "Yes." "He's alive?" "He's alive and in custody, and he told us where to find you. He did it in about 45 seconds. She watched his face process that. "He's not as committed to you as you designed him to be. When the alternative was what Dorian was offering, he chose quickly." Something moved through Harlan's face at that, not hurt exactly, because she didn't think he operated in that register, but the specific response of a man who has made an error in his model and is identifying where the error entered. Cassian's loyalty had been a variable he thought he understood, and he had been wrong about it, and the wrongness was not dramatic or emotional. It was technical, the clean failure of a mechanism that had been built with a flaw he hadn't caught. He looked at Dorian. Dorian was standing 6 feet inside the door. He had not moved since he came through it. The cut above his eyebrow had started bleeding again slightly. The small reopening of something that had clotted and then been asked to do too much. And there was a thin dark line running from it toward his temple that he hadn't noticed or wasn't attending to. He was looking at his uncle with an expression that she could not have described to anyone who hadn't spent the last 11 years learning the geography of Dorian Vescari's face. It was the expression of a man who had loved someone. Past tense, active throughout the night, resolved now into whatever form love took when the person it had been directed at turned out to have been operating for years as its opposite. Why? Dorian said. One word. Not the why of a man who needed information. She had given him all the information, the account numbers and the photographs, and the trust structure built around his dead mother's name. But the why of a man who needed something that information couldn't provide. The why that lived below the facts. Harlan looked at him for a long moment. She thought he might refuse to answer. Men like Harlan often did. The discipline of silence, the refusal to give even one more thing to the people who were taking everything. But he said, "Because you were going to waste it." Dorian's expression didn't change. "Everything I built," Harlan said. 40 years, the structure, the reach, the relationships. I built it, and I handed it to you, and you spent 12 years consolidating and not expanding, defending and not growing. You had more power than your father ever had, and you were going to die with roughly the same empire you inherited because you didn't have the vision for what it could become. He said it without heat, with the flat delivery of a man presenting an analysis he had made some time ago and had long since finished feeling about. Cassian had the vision. I gave him the resources and the method. The outcome was going to serve the family better than anything you would have done with another 20 years. You were going to kill me, Dorian said. Yes. The word was so unadorned that it seemed to alter the air in the room. No qualification, no architecture of justification. Just the fact, stated with the same directness that Harlan had used for every other fact in his life, including the ones that were also terrible. Dorian breathed. She watched his chest rise and fall, once, deliberate. She watched his right hand, which was at his side and which was still, and she thought about everything she had watched that hand do or not do over the course of a night that had required every version of control she possessed. He said, "You used her name." Harlan's expression shifted for the first time. Something that was not quite surprise. Harlan Vescari was not a man who was surprised easily, but the specific response of someone who has been reached in a place they did not expect to be reachable. "The trust," Dorian said. "You put her name on it." It was... Harlan stopped. For the first time in this conversation, and possibly the first time in a very long time, he stopped himself before he completed a sentence. He looked at the table, then back at Dorian. "She would have understood what I was doing." "She would have understood," Dorian repeated. His voice was very quiet. "You think she would have understood that you used her name to hide money you were building to pay for her son's murder?" The room held that. Harlan said nothing. Celine looked at him. At this man she had sat across from at family dinners for 11 years. At the face she had read carefully and had never quite been able to make fully legible. At the architecture of a person who had constructed his entire life around the management of outcome, and had managed outcomes for so long that the thing that made outcomes worth managing had been consumed by the management of them. She did not feel what she had expected to feel looking at him now. She had expected something hotter. What she felt was closer to the cold, final sadness of comprehension, the specific grief of understanding something completely and finding that the understanding provided no comfort whatsoever. "Ida," she said. "Liquidation is stopped," Ida said from the laptop. "I've initiated a reverse trace on the distribution network. It's going to take 6 to 8 hours for the full documentation to compile, but what I can send right now is enough." She pushed her glasses up. "The server packages are ready." "Send them." Ida sent them. Harlan watched this happen with the expression of a man watching something collapse that had taken him a very long time to build. She expected some response, the controlled professional affect breaking, the performance of composure finally failing. What she saw instead was something more honest and more disturbing than either of those. She saw a man who had already incorporated this outcome into his model, who had built a contingency for this, the same way he had built contingencies for everything, and who was now, with a stillness that she found almost incomprehensible, moving to the version of the plan that this outcome required. His hand moved toward the phone on the table. She was there before his fingers closed around it. She put her hand flat on the table over the phone and looked at him from 18 inches away and said, "Don't." He looked back at her. His eyes were very pale and very clear, and they had the quality of eyes that had assessed everything they ever looked at, and found the assessment useful, and were doing it now, doing it to her, and she let him look because there was nothing in her face that she needed to hide. "You've already made the call," she said. "Whatever you set in motion when you heard Mace go down in the corridor, you made the call in the time between that and us coming through the door." She watched his face. "What did you start?" Harlan said nothing. She picked up the phone, looked at the recent calls. One number, called at the moment she had calculated. Duration 11 seconds. Long enough to say something brief and specific to someone who already knew what the brief specific thing meant. She looked at the number. She looked at Ida. She held the phone out and Ida took it without breaking her rhythm at the laptop. "Can you identify the recipient?" "Working," Ida said. Dorian crossed the room and took Harlan by the arm, not roughly, and moved him to the chair by the window. Harlan sat. He did not resist and he did not perform non-resistance. He simply sat, with the quality of a man who had made his moves and was now waiting to see what the board looked like. "What did you activate?" Dorian asked him. Harlan looked up at his nephew. "What would you have done," he said, "if your back was against the wall and you had 11 seconds? "I would have activated something I still controlled," Dorian said. "Yes," Harlan said. "So would I." Ida said from the table, "The number belongs to a woman named Lorraine Hecht. She's listed as the administrator of the Saltern Group. She has signing authority over 3 accounts connected to the holding structure." She paused. "She's also listed as an emergency contact for the Vescari Family Trust's legal entity. The contact has been in that position for 9 years. 9 years. Celine looked at Dorian. He was looking at Harlan. "She has access to assets that aren't in the main structure," Celine said. It was not a question. She was building it as she spoke, the way she had been building things all night, from the architecture of what she could see toward the shape of what she couldn't. "A parallel structure, below the one I found. You built a foundation under the foundation." Harlan said nothing, which was its own answer. "How much?" she asked. He looked at her with those pale, clear eyes and the ghost of something that might, on another face, have been appreciation. "Enough," he said. "Where's Lorraine Hecht right now?" "I have no idea," Harlan said. "Ida," Celine said. "Already looking," Ida said. What followed was 40 minutes of the most painstaking work she had done since she opened the first account statement 18 months ago. Ida at the laptop, Celine beside her, the two of them moving through layers of financial architecture with the systematic precision of people who understood that the work was the work, and it didn't respond to urgency, only to accuracy. Dorian stood by the window with Harlan in the chair beside him and said nothing. Galt and the 2 unnamed men secured the building and confirmed that Mace in the corridor had been the only protection Harlan had brought. 1 man. Harlan had come to Milwaukee with 1 man, because Harlan had believed he was invisible, because he had spent 40 years building structures specifically designed to make him invisible, and had trusted those structures the way he had trusted everything he built, completely on the basis of the quality of his own work, without sufficient accounting for the possibility that someone had been watching them long enough to find the seams. Lorraine Hecht was in a hotel in Indianapolis. Ida found her through the phone number's connection to a credit card and the credit card's most recent transaction, which was a room service charge placed 40 minutes ago, which meant she was awake and she was waiting, and she was in room 714 of a hotel whose name Celine relayed to Galt, who made a call, who reached a contact in Indianapolis, who reached the hotel in under 20 minutes. Lorraine Hecht did not run. When the people arrived at room 714, she opened the door and gave them the laptop she'd been working at and the 2 phones she'd been monitoring and said, in a voice that suggested she had also incorporated this version of the outcome into her model, "I'll need to speak with an attorney." The documentation from Lorraine Hecht's laptop added a 3rd layer to what Ida had already compiled. By the time the full picture assembled itself on the screen in that Milwaukee room, with the sky outside beginning to shift toward the gray-blue pre-announcement of morning, what they had was not a case. It was an archive. Comprehensive, cross-referenced, the kind of evidence structure that had no weaknesses because it had been built by people trying to hide things rather than people trying to find them. And hiding things required specificity, and specificity left traces, and Celine had been patient enough to follow traces for a very long time. She sent the final packages at 6:14 in the morning. Every significant family represented at the Meridian Grand received a document. Every federal contact who had been receiving information from inside the Viscari organization for the last 4 years received a document that identified the source of that information and the financial relationship underlying it. 3 journalists received materials through channels that ensured the materials were verifiable and the sources were protected. 2 federal prosecutors received structured evidence packages that had been legally prepared by Ida with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent 3 decades understanding exactly what prosecutors needed and exactly how they needed it formatted. Harlan Viscari sat in the chair by the window and watched the sky get lighter and said nothing. At 6:41, Dorian told Galt to take Harlan downstairs. Galt did. Harlan stood without being asked a second time, adjusted his shirt sleeves with the small automatic gesture of a man maintaining a performance whose audience had left, and walked out of the room with the straightness of a 71-year-old man who had decided that the body was non-negotiable, even now, even here, even at the end of the version of his life that had been worth maintaining the performance for. He did not look back at Dorian. Dorian watched him go. Celine stood at the table with the laptop and the phone and the glass of amber liquid that Harlan had not finished, and looked at the room that this man had been living in for 6 days, the deliberate order of it, the absence of sentimentality, no photographs, nothing personal in the conventional sense, only the tools of a man whose personhood had long since been entirely subsumed into the project of his own strategic intelligence. She thought about what he had said, that Dorian was going to waste it. 40 years of work and the man who inherited it was going to die with roughly what he'd started with. She thought about the specific cruelty of that logic, the way it had laundered a decision to kill his own nephew into a business analysis, the way it had converted the murder of a person he had known since childhood into a corrective measure, the way it required a complete and practiced removal of the thing that made any of it matter. She thought about what that removal cost. Not morally. She was not interested in the moral accounting right now. Others would do that work. She was interested in the human cost, the thing that happened to a person who maintained that removal for long enough. What was left? Whether what was left could be called a life in any sense she recognized. She thought it couldn't. She thought the architecture Harlan had built was also a prison, and he had been living in it for so long that he could no longer see the walls. Dorian came to stand beside her. They stood at the table in the early morning light, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Outside, through the third-floor windows, Milwaukee was beginning to exist again. The first trucks on the street, the sky completing its transition from dark to gray to something that promised, without committing to, daylight. "What happens now?" Dorian said. It wasn't a question directed at her specifically. It was the sound of a man thinking out loud in the presence of the only person he trusted to hear it. She said, "To the organization?" "To everything." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The federal unit that surrounded the Meridian last night, the documentation we sent this morning will complicate whatever case they were building because the case was built on information Harlan was providing. And that source is now discredited. That buys time, not immunity." She turned slightly toward him. "The families will want a meeting. They'll want to understand what they were shown and what it means and who's making decisions. If you're not at that meeting, someone else makes those decisions. And if I am, then you make them." She paused. "Or I do." He looked at her. She looked back. "I'm not going back to what I was," she said. It came out evenly, without the particular weight of a declaration, because she was not making a declaration. She was stating something that had already become true sometime during the last 8 hours, in the tunnels, or the storage unit, or the loading area, or the car ride north with 18 inches of charged space between them. "I'm not going back to what I was. And I'm not going to become the thing you'd need me to be to run this organization the way you've been running it." "I'm not asking you to," Dorian said. "You might ask me without meaning to." She held his gaze. "The power does that. It makes the request without asking." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you want?" She thought about it. Not what she was supposed to want, not what the situation suggested, not what would be strategic or protective or smart. Just what she wanted, in the honest, simplest form of it. I want to take what's left of this organization's legitimate structure and make it actually legitimate, she said. The properties, the holding companies, the financial infrastructure that Harlan built, the parts of it that aren't blood-soaked. There's enough there to build something real, something that doesn't require what this has required. She looked at the window, the lightening sky. I want to do that. I'm good at it, and I've been thinking about how to do it for 3 years, and I know exactly where to start. And the rest, Dorian said. The rest has to go, she said. Not because it's wrong, though it is. Because it's finished. You can't rebuild what happened last night. You can't rebuild what Harlan and Cassian dismantled. Every alliance is broken. Every protected relationship is now a liability. Every captain is going to spend the next year wondering who was working with Cassian and whether the man standing next to him knows. She looked at him. The empire is over. What's left is what we make from the material. Dorian was looking at her with that expression she still didn't have a full name for. It had accumulated components through the night. The revision, the devastation, the specific quality of attention he had finally, at catastrophic cost, learned to direct at her. And now, in the morning light, it had something additional, something quieter. 11 years, he said. Yes. I can't account for them all tonight. No, she agreed. You can't. But I want to. She looked at him for a long moment. At the cut above his eyebrow, and the bruised jaw, and the gray in his hair that the light was catching, and beneath all of it, the face of the man she had married in a building that no longer stood, who had been exactly as impossible and as insufficient as she had known he was on the day she married him, and whom she had loved anyway, with the specific stubbornness of a person who confused depth with permanence. She did not tell him what she felt. She had learned over 11 years of telling him things he wasn't ready to hear that the telling was not always the right instrument. She picked up Harlan's unfinished glass from the table and walked to the window and poured it out onto the sill, watching the amber liquid spread and run and disappear at the edge. Then she put the glass down and looked at the sky, which was fully light now. The gray converted entirely to the pale particular blue of a Midwestern October morning, clean and cold and indifferent to everything that had happened under it. I know a lawyer in the loop, she said. She specializes in the restructuring of financial entities under duress. She's good, and she doesn't ask more than she needs to ask. She was still looking at the sky. I'm going to call her this morning. For the organization. For the legitimate parts of it. She paused. For what we build after. She heard him move, not toward her, just a shift in position, the settling of a large man into a different orientation in a room. And then she heard his voice, very close, which meant he had moved after all without her registering the movement. Celine, he said. She turned. He was standing 2 feet from her with his hands at his sides and his face at full exposure. No performance, no managed surface, nothing she hadn't already seen tonight in its worst and most stripped-down form. He said, I would do it differently. I know, she said. I need you to know that I know it isn't enough. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the window, at the city beginning to move below, at the light that was now without question morning. It's a start, she said. They left Milwaukee at 7:40 in the morning, the 2 vehicles south on the interstate, the city arriving and then surrounding them as they crossed back into Illinois. Ida rode with them this time, in the back seat, the laptop open, continuing to work with the focused silence of a woman who had found her purpose in the accounting and was not done accounting. Torres, according to Dex's brief text, was going to need a surgical consultation and had been characteristically unimpressed by this information. Celine drove again. Nobody questioned it. Nobody suggested alternatives. She took the wheel and Dorian took the passenger seat this time, and the arrangement felt less like a statement than a fact that the night had simply produced, the way the night had produced all the other facts, at cost, through specificity, without the cushioning of the story she had once tried to tell about her own life. They drove south through the morning, the road clear and the light growing, and somewhere in the middle of it her phone rang with a number she recognized. The first family representative returning contact, the first of what would be many such calls. The beginning of the accounting that would take months and would not be clean and would require more of her than almost anything in the previous 8 hours. She let it ring once more. Then she answered it. She answered it with the same voice she had used all night. Level, specific, stripped of performance. And she told the man on the other end that she was available to meet, that she would have full documentation to him within the hour, and that when he was ready to have a real conversation about what came next, she would be the person he should call. She said her name at the end, not Mrs. Vescari, not Dorian's wife, not the woman who had been escorted out of a ballroom and dismissed and discarded in front of everyone who mattered in this world. Her name, Celine Ashcroft. The man on the other end was quiet for a moment. Then he said he understood. She ended the call and put the phone in the cup holder between the seats and kept driving, both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road ahead, where the city was fully visible now. The towers and the grid of it, the particular compressed immensity of a place that had been burning all night in the specific invisible way of cities where the burning happened inside buildings and inside organizations and inside marriages and was never visible from the outside until it was finished. Chicago at 8 in the morning. Indifferent and specific and already moving on. She kept her eyes on the road and drove toward it.